Hey, what's up, YouTube? This is Richie from. I'm sorry, I'm trying to think of something silly to say at the same time I'm adjusting my tie. Yeah, this is Richie from Agartha here, and New World Order doesn't want you to know that Hillary Clinton is covering up the original Hyperborean civilization. So we're going to continue with some academic papers on how the occult influenced the Soviet Russia and the new alt-right movements that are coming today. It's just part of a series of hobnobbing that I've started. Most of the papers that I want to do in this are going to be academic papers. Maybe people will start taking this idea and this threat seriously and see that it's not just some stupid conspiracy theory, but something that's very well documented. Um, and it's not a cult because these secret societies have been running the world for centuries, millennia. It's a the occult comes into play because of the failure of Christians to maintain a proper Christian epistemology. Um, that which is underlies the natural theology of Aquinas, Augustine, and the Platonic worldview. Um, with Kant and his critiques of human understanding, and also the Maestra and the traditionalists, the world was submerged. The Western world was submerged into uh, an epistemology that resembles cult epistemology, wherein they say it's unreasonable, it's impossible to reason to God, to understanding God, or the existence of God, and therefore you still have to believe in Him, but it's unreasonable. And this is a double bind, which is a common cult mechanism used for keeping people within otherwise insane situations they wouldn't as a normal thinking person under common sense would not stay within. And sadly, I think this is kind of the basis of Orthodox epistemology. Um, and so let's get on with the academic paper here. That's just my introduction because most people want, as soon as they hear the word theosophy or the word occult, they immediately shut off their brain and say, "This guy's satanic panic." And this isn't what we're talking about. We're talking about epistemology and philosophy, why it leads to occultism. Because if understanding God is closed to reason, then everything related to God becomes occult. It becomes simply secluded to revelation, and therefore necessarily it is occult. So the word occult, following Maria, this is the occult revival in Russia today and its impact on literature. Birget, Menzel, and maybe Dugan is in here somewhere. Yep, Dugan's mentioned in here, and the Golovin movement. Um, but this will just a little cultural background on this. Then I want to go into, it's an article by Leonid LaRouche called "The Cultural Inferiority of the Soviets." So, and it's a little more direct. It's a little less academic hobnobbing than this, but hopefully by promoting academic papers, people of academic circles will come out of their holes and maybe realize that this is related to a political problem, which is seeking to destroy the U.S. and Western civilization. The word occult, following Maria Carlson's broad definition, embraces the whole range of psychological, physiological, cosmological, and physical and spiritual phenomena. From Latin word occultus, hidden or secret, applying therefore to the study of the Kabbalah, astrology, alchemy, and all arcane sciences. The occult always comprises both a number of theoretical. How is this full screen? This isn't full screen. Gay. Fake J. This full screen button's fake in J. Um, according to esoteric. Okay, hold up. The occult is always comprised of both a number of theoretical and philosophical concepts and a number of practices which are supposed to lead the person involved to an experience of higher, ultimately divine knowledge and consciousness. According to esoteric thinking, this is considered ultimately a path to elevate and realize the divine essence within the human life. However, sometimes it is not used to achieve higher consciousness or divine knowledge, but to deliberately make effective use of dark, evil forces. The occult has always been used for different ends, for purposes that range benignly spiritual to totalitarian or fascist. As concealed with wisdom, the occult is linked to, but not identical with, mysticism as secret experience. It is also linked to the term esoteric, which from the Greek esoterikos, secret teaching, can be traced to Greek philosophy of the 3rd century AD. Probably Neoplatonist, following the Proclus line, and can be applied to all cultures. But today, in a semantic context shaped since the late 19th century, esoteric is used in two separate senses as a general term for occult practices and teaching in communities, and two, in an inner path to certain spiritual experiences that goes beyond following dogmas and ideas in an external formal manner and which is connected with tradition, secrecy, and initiation. Nothing is naturally esoteric. Esotericism is a designation of a historical role of certain ideas and methods within a culture rather than a description of their intrinsic characteristics. As an adjective, esoterical describes a culture's attitude towards ideas rather than ideas themselves. All three terms, occult, mystic, and esoteric, are often used synonymously, although they refer to different historical and ideological contexts. For scholarly analysis, however, the use of the term should be therefore be specified in the context in which they are used should be spelled out. The prevalence of the occult and esoteric ideas and topics in post-Soviet culture is a fact that many Western scholars of contemporary Russia have encountered, either through the vast literature or simply by visiting bookstores and street vendors in Moscow and St. Petersburg, as well as other critics like Kazan, Novosibirsk, and Khabarovsk. It is almost impossible to understand contemporary Russian literature without being equipped with an encyclopedia of the occult. In the 1990s, no less than 39% of all nonfiction publications in the humanities dealt with occult esoteric topics. Some former Soviet thick journals, for example, Literatuno Obozrenie and Nauka i Religia, have adopted a whole new profile with publications on aspects of the occult. The revival has been described by the same Western scholars, for instance, Elliot Bornstein, Valentina Broger, and Holly Denio Stevens, as a phenomena of popular culture, and one that might be quick to assume that it represents a primarily one way import of the New Age ideas and publications flooding the commercialized Russia from the West. Um, One thing I want to update is in the last show, we discussed a guy named John G. Bennett who was smuggling Gurdjieff publications into Russia, into the Golovin Circle. Now, this guy is a was an MI6 agent working for military intelligence in Middle Eastern affairs, and he was involved as the major promoter and patron for British intelligence of something called the Subud cult, which may or may not be tied into Obama's mother. I don't know how much influence that would actually have on Obama, but it's just a curious fact. And it's more curious in this context that this guy working for British military intelligence is one of the main promoters of the New Age in Russia. Um, and he was also a personal disciple of, I think, Peter Ouspensky. Um, publications flooding into commercialized Russia into the West. I will argue that the occult revival in Russia is by no means simply a question of popular culture. The fascination with the esoteric, supernatural, and non orthodox spirituality with popular utopian and pagan folk traditions in post Soviet Russia can be found on all levels intellectual and artistic life, including the science and politics. One can discern a considerable impact on esoteric ideas and ideologies, not only in the humanities, but also the sciences. Newly established organizations based on the ideology of cosmism, such as the Association for a Complex Survey of the Russian Nation, Asociacja Kompleksnому Izucheniu Roskoi Nazi, also AKIRN, which has ties with several pan Slavic circles, closely collaborates with the Slavic International Union of Aviation and Aeronautics, Slavia Kosmos, with the Mir Station and with the Museum of History of Aviation and Aeronautics. The sheer number of conferences and research projects, university, of course, offering and college textbooks on supernatural powers from bioenergy theories, the so called torsionic fields, to UFOs and cosmic consciousness produced by scientists at the highest academic ranks has been so disturbing that in 2002, a commission within the Russian Academy of Sciences was founded to warn and propagate against the spread of obscure pseudoscience. The occult is also connected with the healing sciences shamanism as an alternative medicine and has entered scientific discourses in Russia and in the West. In July 2005, the International Congress of Transpersonal Psychology was held for the first time in Moscow. Transpersonal psychology, a branch of professional psychology, was founded in America by psychologist Ken Wilber and is based on the esoteric approach and worldview. I'm going to check the comments. What's up, John Brisson? Thank you. Let's hope we don't get crashed now that Fed John Brisson is in the chat. Hopefully everything goes fine. Hopefully John's forgiving me for not coming on to his show. John's a tough handler, I gotta say. Really tough handler. Unforgiving. A considerable number of practicing Russian psychologists and psychiatrists participated in this Congress. I will show that today's occult revival should be seen, first of all, as the result of 7 decades of forceful suppression of metaphysical thought in Russia. The spiritual vacuum caused by the downfall of communism helps to explain the strong impact of belief systems outside of established religions. As Mikhail Epstein writes, many more people now exit atheism than enter the churches. They exit atheism without arriving, they stay somewhere at the crossroads. The Russian people have a desire for wisdom, unity, and a holistic being, which reaches out beyond the dogmas and traditionally confined systems of established religions. Imagine a young man from a typical Soviet family who, for 3 or 4 generations, has been completely cut off from any religious traditions except Russian Orthodoxy. That's my added comment there. And now that he hears a calling voice, the voice of God from above, this young man is unable to determine into which church under what roof he should take cover. All historical religions are equally alien to him. He seeks belief and finds only religious confessions for Roispovedania, and it is precisely in this gap between the yearning for belief and traditional confessions that the poor religion emerges, one without dogma, books, or rituals. This crossroads is, in fact, the crucial point where all paths merge, a point of common belief, equally accepting all beliefs as leading to one unified belief. Simply belief in the good. Poor religion is a religion without further definition. And this is a quote from, let's see if they actually include it here, Michael Epstein. For Epstein, the particular search for the spiritual reorganization, which he calls poor religion or religious modernism, is a uniquely post atheist phenomenon and thus inseparably linked with the Soviet past, which all believers had formerly been equal in relation to monolithic atheist state. The negative sign has now been turned into a positive one in the same totalizing, undistinguished way. This uniqueness, however, is open to the question if the religious renaissance is seen in a broader international context. Wouter Hanegraaff, professor of the history of Hermetic philosophy and related currents at the University of Amsterdam, argues that the emergence of modernity itself is intertwined with the history of esotericism. However, surviving examples of Western esoteric currents are not recognized as an integral part of our collective cultural heritage and are insufficiently documented, studied, and preserved. What we see today in Russia is a merging of different traditions, a popularization of the occult, counterculture of the post-Stalinist period, various permutations of Russian occult in the early 20th century, Russian culture, and a re-migration of occult ideas processed through the Western New Age. Must not lose sight of the specific historical conditions at play, since mystical utopian and pagan roots in religious and intellectual belief systems, and more generally in Russian folk culture, were stronger than what was found in modern Western societies and had a pervasive influence throughout the 20th century. Historical conditions also include different uses of the occult by the Soviet state and by the people in both the official and unofficial circles. Uses of the occult by the state range from trading in the life and works of the theosophical Buddhist mystic Nicholas Roerich in exchange for US dollars and Soviet propaganda abroad, to experiments with mind control and psychic warfare. This is an academic paper, by the way, academic paper. To experiments with mind control and psychic warfare for political and military reasons, which was also practiced in the United States. Uh, that's cited from William Dick and Henry Grease, The New Soviet Psychic Discoveries. Um, Also quoting Jose M.R. Delgado, Physical Control of the Mind Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society, which I own. Alex Constantine, Virtual Government CIA Mind Control Operations in America. And John Marks, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, the CIA and Mind Control. So I guess these aren't crazy conspiracy theorist sources that this person's using. In spite of some of the claims to the scientific atheism, Soviet civilization was from the very beginning influenced by religion. Atheist communism. It defined itself as a purely rational, idiocratic society based on science and empirical knowledge, but its cult of the rational was taken to such an extreme that one could talk in terms of rationalistic religion. In the 1920s, and again in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when science merged with utopian thinking, when during the proclaimed cosmic era, borders shifted between science and fantastic fiction, certain disciplines, for example, telepathy, hypnosis, and parapsychology, to choose three topics traditionally connected with spiritual and occult thought, all experienced a boom. Commissions at the Academy of Science explored the phenomenon of alien intelligence, intergalactic UFOs, and the Tungus meteorite in Siberia, and anthropoids, the abominable snowman Yeti in Tibetan Himalaya. Oh man, there's the Yeti link, Bigfoot link. Oh my goodness. All these projects evoked strong popular interest and were accompanied by extended discussions in popular scientific journals. In order to bring attention to a wide range of uses of the occult and to help open up the new perspective of cultural history, I will approach these topics here as broadly as possible. I will sketch some context of the occult in Soviet unofficial culture and then suggest a typology of approaches to the occult, each of which can be applied to contemporary context. To illustrate the impact of current Russian literature, I will then discuss three literary texts, all written after 1990. Olisaya Nikolaeva's story, A Cripple from Childhood, Yuri Mamlev's novel Flickering Time, and Vladimir Sorokin's novel Ice, and Bro's Path. In conclusion, I will address the role and function of the occult in Russia today. For some reason, they capitalized today as if it was Russia Today, the TV show. Um, I'll be right back. I got to get the lighting fixed here. Oh my goodness. Okay. Mom's basement is cramped. What is up with this freaking caller? All right, if you haven't done so, like and subscribe, share on Twitter, give an at Edward Habsburg, and tell him how a new Cardinal Richelieu or Cardinal Mazarin should come and spank his behind. Anyway, we're going on. Flashes of the occult in the Soviet past. See, I just lost half of my audience by adjusting the lighting. I guess they like it when I speak from the shadows. Um, Flashes of the occult in the Soviet past. The considerable impact of theosophy and other occult theories on Russian symbolist literature and art, and the fact that so many Russian intellectuals at some point were fascinated by theosophy, including later Marxists such as Anatoly Lunacharsky, Maxim Gorky, and Sergei Eisenstein, has been the subject of numerous studies, in particular Maria Carlson's brilliant study of theosophy influence on the high artistic culture, and more recently by Bogomolov, Abadnin, and Stoll Schweitzer. Monographs have been published about the historical influence of the occult on Russian literature and culture in 19th century, including its reception in popular culture. Barry, Leighton, Manhertz. New perspectives have been opened up by the Russian avant-garde, where philosophical concepts of immortality, the technological utopias, and energy theories of concrete time and space have been seen as interrelated. The influence of theosophical ideas and esoteric traditions on theory and practice of poets and artists has been documented and analyzed by Malevich, Kandinsky, Filanov, and Larionov. Only now that the complete edition of Malevich's work has been published and his prolific philosophical writings have become accessible can we fully understand the extent to which the artist considered himself a spiritual founder of the new religion. Moreover, some new cultural studies, Hagemeister, Dalrymple, Henderson, Patron, and Greenfield, have begun to focus on the complex interrelations among science, technology, utopia, and religion, and have invested the metaphysical undercurrents of the avant-garde. Bernice Rosenthal's The Occult in Russian and Soviet Culture is the first study to focus on selective topics in the Soviet period, but the history of the occult in Soviet, in particular the post-Stalinist world, which would have included the manner in which the occult was transformed, adapted, and implemented into Soviet society and science, as well as the religious philosophical renaissance in the 1970s, is still almost completely unknown and unstudied. This is one problem that confronts every researcher who's dealing with this at the present time. Thus, the rediscovery of abstract art in the avant garde of the 1920s during the thaw by artists like Valery Schwartzman, Vladimir Weisberg, Tatiana Nazarenko, Vladimir Nemukin, and Yevgeny Kropotnitsky, which proved so important for underground culture and perestroika, had its strongest impact not by means of its political message, constructivism, or sterile geometry, but by the individual and spiritual challenge of transcendency. Valery Turchin recalls his own discovery of abstract painting in the late 1950s. He says abstract art symbolizes the presence of individual, its mythological transpersonal being. The kind of art appeals to persons who notice the signs of creation and the elements of the transcendental in life. We can state, which with certainty, that the rich tradition of the occult during the first decades of century was violently interrupted in the 1930s. A note on transpersonal: the word transpersonal, I imagine, is influenced first of all by the personalist uh, replacement of the concept of the individual and the concept of the society at large. It's a merger of the two, where man is a hypostasis of the greater being of man, and yeah, it's not a good philosophy, and it's one of the worst philosophies that comes out of this Kantian, Demonstrian counter-revolutionary or counter enlightenment system. Um, Maybe someday we'll take a deep dive into that so I can prove just exactly what I'm talking about. Prohibition and the political repression made any continuous activity virtually impossible. The question, however, of how far the ground for today's occult revival was laid by direct influences from the past, that is, whether one can discern a continuity of occult undercurrents throughout Soviet history, and how much this revival represents an important or remigration of ideas from the West, can only be answered after more material has been collected and this history becomes the subject of further study. The following examples illustrate some context of the occult and Soviet period, which need to be addressed in the future studies. Theosophical and anthroposophical ideas continued to survive in the Soviet times. After being officially banned, most theosophists and anthroposophists chose immigration, but private relations continued, including communication between emigre and those left behind in Russia. As recently published documents from the archives of the KGB show several esoteric orders in Soviet Russia remained active in the 1930s. For instance, the secret order of the Rosicrucian Temples in Moscow, St. Peter, existed until 1937. Rosicrucian Templars. The poet Marina Tsvetaeva's sister Anastasia was one of its members. The members of the order, who came from all professional levels, doctors, engineers, artists, technicians, scientists, had developed a secret language, created a body of text and established complex structure of communication. Since all materials were confiscated in 1937 and all members were extensively interrogated by OGPU special agents for occult matters, some of the published documents from the archives offer materials from inside the history of secret societies, something which is rarely accessible. In the 1990s, all these associations, the Theosophical Society, the Lectorium Rosicrucianum, and the Anthroposophical Society were officially reestablished. The painter and practicing Buddhist Nikolai Roerich, a figure of the benign esoteric influence and a mystic theosophist with an international morale and political impact in both East and West, emigrated to the Himalayas after living in Russia and the United States, and became internationally renowned ambassador of peace. Roerich, a cult figure in a post-Soviet Russia, is significant for both bringing Oriental elements into the Russian occult and for bridging decades and cultures. The 1910s and 20s, with the post-Stalinist decades, Roerich began his artistic career in the decade of symbolism and established his fame first as a scenarist and set designer, there we go, for Igor Stravinsky's Rites of Spring in 1920. After coming to New York, Roerich followed neither the aesthetic path nor abstract avant-garde painting or socialist neorealism. Moreover, he still traveled to Moscow and managed to establish a semi-official status with the Soviet government and friendly relations with some organizations for foreign propaganda since the late 1920s. At the same time, he translated Helena Blavatsky's main work, The Secret Doctrine, into Russian and prepared for his retreat to India and Tibet. His peace mission was used as a token of by political propaganda in the Russian-Indian relations. Some of his paintings were sold to the West and thus brought foreign currency to the Soviet state. After his death in 1947, Roerich was celebrated, officially canonized, and studied in the Soviet Union. Canonized? What does that mean? Does that mean in the Orthodox Church? I have no idea. His paintings, as well as those by his son Sviatoslav, in the same style, were exhibited in Leningrad and Novosibirsk. Nikita Khrushchev, who saw Sviatoslav Roerich's painting in India, was so enthusiastic that he had an exhibit mounted in the Hermitage Museum. But Roerich's various activities and engagement in efforts for international peace, ecological and environmental issues, as well as alternative medicine, not to mention the practice of Buddhism in Russia and liberation of the Mongolian and Tibetan people, also gave a political dimension to his occult convictions and his involvement with theosophy and Buddhism. Since the 1960s, Roerich has had a growing membership of disciples among the artists and intellectuals in Russia and the West. Roerich scholars even managed to publish some of his esoteric essays, literary texts, in official journals such as Moskva and Nakua Itzin. The writer Valentin M. Sidorov got involved in the occult through personal contacts with theosophists of the older generation who had managed to preserve private libraries, who had been giving underground lectures since the late 1950s, among them the psychiatrist and mystic Nadezhda Mikhailovna Kostomarova, a descendant of the famous historian Nikolai Ivanovich Kostomarov. In 1982, Valentin Sidorov published an account in the mainstream journal Moskva of his own expedition and spiritual initiation to the Himalayas, entitled 7 Days in the Himalayas, which caused a long and controversial debate and also attracted new followers. Since the 1990s, Roerich's collection writings include the personal esoteric concept Agni Yoga, have been published, as well as 11 monographs on the life and works of Nikolai Roerich and his son Sviatoslav. The Roerich Association in Russia and the New York have gained in popularity. The Roerich Museum in Moscow, which opened in 1991, together with newly established research centers in St. Petersburg and Novosibirsk, have established an international network of conferences and other activities, which has been particularly active since 1995 via the internet. The publishing house Molodaya Gvardaya, Young Guard, which has also specialized in science fiction literature, has figured as another center of the occult. Through and after the official ban in 1977 on parapsychology, which had experienced a boom in the 1960s era of cybernetics and space travel, the extended discussion in popular journals about UFOs, extraterrestrial aliens, Caucasian snowmen was also stopped. Nevertheless, scientists continued to meet and exchange their ideas under the seemingly innocent cover of science fiction clubs. Sounds a lot like the Fabian Socialists to me. The impact of the long term close relationship between those who were interested in astrophysics, parapsychology, and science fiction, and who also engaged in such figures as Roerich, Fyodorov, and Tsiolkovsky can be seen, for example, in the 20-volume anthology Biblioteka Ruskoi Fantastiki, the Library of Russian Science Fiction, published since 1990 by Yuri Medvedev, Molodaya Gvardia's editor-in-chief. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the so-called Yushninsky Periulok, Yushninsky Lane Circle of Artists and Poets, I think this is the Golovin Circle. It is. Here we go. So these are the people around Dugin. And of course, that's when my computer decides to move the page. Okay. So-called Yushninsky Lane Circle of Artists and Poets that gathered around the writer Yuri Mamlev, named for the address in Mamlev's apartment, had a strong influence not only on several of today's well-known writers, for example, Vladimir Sorokin and Viktor Erofeev, but also on the mystical ideologists of what many consider Russian neo-fascism, namely Alexander Dugin and Guido Jamal, who today have become part of the official politics. In the 1950s, the young Mamlev discovered the Western classics of occult writing in Moscow Lenin Library, Evola Eliphas Levi, Papus, and Karl Duprel. Other occult texts, for example, Blavatsky Steiner and Peter Uspensky, began to circulate in early days of Samizdat. They called themselves the sexual mystics or metaphysics, and not only studied esoteric literature and recited their own writings, but also some witnesses and scholars have confirmed that they experimented with practices of excessive amoral behavior and acted out what some have described as the poetics of monstrosity. Other writers also initiated in occult circles, for example, Arkady Rovner and Yevgeny Golovin, disciples of George Grushchev. In the 1970s, Rovner and his wife, the poetess Victoria Andreevna, founded the circle Gnosis in Moscow. Most of them emigrated in the 1970s and, like Mamlev, got involved with the New Age philosophy in the West. Rovner also operates some sort of parapsychology think tank in England that has now been taken over by some English aristocrat. I just remembered that. Let me see if I can get the name for you. Yeah, the cultivation of inner states. And Lord Pentland is now the director, I believe. So what I see with Brexit and all of this is the piece for the British in his pan-European or pan-Slavic Eurasian Union. Um, and I wouldn't put it past him to try to create some sort of union with these individuals. I wonder if this is the current president of the... Oh, Henry John Sinclair Interesting last name, since that's the name that the hoaxer Pantard took when he created his Habsburg cult called the Prayer of Zion. Um, Now it says he died, so I wonder if this. So that was the second Baron of Pentland, and then Paul Benedict Colin is the current Lord Pentland. And well, we can look into that later on, but very interesting. Other writers also initiated occult circles. For example, Arkady Rovner. Okay, we just read that. Founded the Gnosis in Moscow. Most of them emigrated in the 1970s, and like Mamlev, got involved with New Age philosophy in the West, promoting the reimmigration of occult ideas through samizdat publications and translations. And beginning in the 1990s, when some of them returned to Russia by joint American-Russian anthologies. The 1970s was a decade of religious and philosophical renaissance. Many intellectuals, writers, and artists, poets, and musicians rediscovered Christianity and chose it for their spiritual reorientation. Others turned to mysticism, the Kabbalah, and the occult, and still others evinced a growing interest in Buddhism and more generally in Eastern religion and philosophy. 1971, Anatoly Pinyeyev founded the first, Hare Krishna group in Moscow. The connection between German fascism and esoteric mysticism, about which there have been occasional publications and discussions in journals since the 1960s, is one of the examples of occult contexts that have been explored in official and popular venues. One of the earliest publications considered a sensation at the time were excerpts from the international bestseller Morning of the Magi, The Martin des Magicians Press, Paris, 1960, by Louis Paul Wells and Jacques Bergier, in the journal Nauka y Religia, 1960. Once again, Paul Wells associated with Alain de Benoit and the political orthodox kind of concept of imperium and the Dionysian heart of hearts of Europe. Close collaborators with Dugin today. But like I said, he was the guy that introduced LSD into France, was a disciple of Gurdjieff, a part of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, all around spook, and the editor-in-chief, I believe, of Le Figaro magazine at that time, which describes for the first time the occult context of Hitler and Nazi politics. Paul Wells, a critical follower of Gregory Gurdjieff, was himself involved in the esoteric quest, while his co-author, the physicist Jacques Bergier, contributed to the science fiction part. The book, one of the early hallmarks of the Western counterculture to challenge the existentialist pessimism of post-war intellectual culture, presented for the first time in post-war historiography information about the esoteric connections of Nazism. For example, the centric cosmological world ice theory by the German scientist Hans Horbiger, which was quite popular in Germany during the late 1920s, and the theory of the Indo-Aryan origins and the Nazi Himalaya connection. Naka y Religia published 30 pages from the second part of this book under the title To Which God Did Hitler Bow? With the following comment: although we must point out the false historical conception of L. Paul Wells and J. Bergier, we consider it necessary to make our readers familiar with the mystical religious cosmogony of the host of the Third Reich. All the more so since the religious side of Hitlerism until now has only been treated from a political perspective. Lev Gumilyov, then a professor at Leningrad University, but already a highly charismatic ideologist of the racist anti-Semitic neo-Eurasianism, responded to this publication with a scholarly article about the supposed historical origins of Shambhala in Syria, the Eastern mythical paradise on earth. The first publication on the esoteric myth of Shambhala in an official scholarly periodical also proved to be a sensation among intellectuals. Some of the ideologists of European Eurasianist extremism, such as Guy de Jamol, a close friend of Alexander Dugin and Yuri Mamlev, were inspired to engage in the occult by Paul Wells and the Bergier book. The historical history of occult circles of the 1960s and 70s has yet to be written. Such a history might well explain today the esoteric orientations of Russian intellectuals today, certain obsessions with dark and evil forces, the background for the fascination with Gnosticism and metaphysics. Approaches to the occult types of involvement in post-Soviet Russia. I will now give a brief overview of the occult context in Russia today, and at the same time suggest a classification of 4 different ways to be involved in the occult. The first, in post-Soviet Russia, the most obvious way to be involved in the occult is through what Michael Epstein has called pop religion, which is basically what we see in popular culture, a mixture of the most diverse and contradictory religious, spiritual, and esoteric ideas, promoted the following practice as an immediate force of salvation. This includes all non-arcane phenomena of popular magic, witchcraft, astrology, cults, and sex, Western mixed with Eastern, Oriental mixed with Orthodox heretics, such as the Old Believers. The attraction to random times, extreme choices, and the readiness to support an amazingly wide variety of irrational synchronistic belief systems can be seen as a transitional reaction to compensate for the formerly imposed atheist condition. The second type of involvement comprises more specific ideologies and includes political uses of the occult, namely neo-paganism, cosmism, and traditionalism. Neo-paganism, whose intellectual roots can be traced to earlier decades, has been gaining force as an ideology since the 1980s. It can be defined as a renaissance of the archaic pagan Slavic religion, which ranges from nationalist ideologies to literature. It is non-political version neo-paganism, which may be viewed as a spiritual cult, is practiced in some of the new utopian communities, whose members moved out of the cities in the 90s. Slavic mythology, widely suppressed in Soviet times, nevertheless became popular in the 1970s with such scholarly publications as Alexander Rybakov's book Paganism and the Old Slavs, and Alexander Klibanov's Social Folk Utopians in Russia, and through the uses of popular utopian ideas and folk myths and literature from peasant poets of the Slavic fantasy. A connecting link for neo-paganists is the so-called Vlesova Kniga, a supposedly archaeological ancient Slavic find mysteriously discovered and preserved by a former White Army officer during the Civil War and published in 1957 in San Francisco. It is made up of several scattered boards of birchwood with carvings in Cyrillic letters, which have been deciphered as ancient tales, spells, and prayers to Slavic gods. This document, like the protocols of the Elder Zion, has long been scientifically proven to be fraudulent, but nevertheless is widely regarded by neo-paganists as proof of the early origins of Slavic culture, spiritualism, and literacy, absent up until now from this sparsely documented prehistory. Representatives of neo-paganism or political occult, as Bernice Rosenthal has put it, includes Alexander Dugin. His theory of geopolitical Eurasianism is based on a occult Indo-Aryan race concept and is gaining considerable influence in a post-Soviet society. From politicians and military academies to intellectuals, formerly leftist countercultural artists, and provincial proletarian skidheads, Dugin combines esoteric orthodoxy with the rehabilitation of paganism, admires Hitler, and hails esoteric Nazi German ideologists like Karl Hoshofer, the co-founder with Kalergi and Otto Habsburg of the Pan-European Union, and also an SS officer. Since 2000, Dugin has moved to the center of political power close to the Putin administration by deliberate strategy of veiling his mystic esoteric ideology. In November 2003, Dugin founded the International Eurasian Movement, inspired by Western theorists of esoteric fascism such as Julie Savola and Alain de Benoit. He has become an official consultant of several leading Russian politicians, and his think tank, Arktogaya, has a strong presence in Russian internet. Marlene Laurel, this is who we read last night, writes about Dugin. Each of his geopolitical reflections is justified by esoteric traditions, astrology, occult sciences, oriental religious texts, Atlantide myths, woolly etymological research, Kabbalah symbolism, similarities between Slavic words, and the vocabulary of classic Oriental civilizations. Another one is Lev Gumilyov, 1912 to 1992, the son of the poets Anna Akhmatova and Nikolai Gumilyov, was a charismatic historian and ethnograph who developed a theory of Slavic ethnogenesis and biosphere, the popularity of which in Russia today cannot be overestimated. With its syncretistic explanations and legitimization of Russian imperial messianism, remember creation of Dostoevsky and Solyov, directly influencing the Third Reich principle of Hitler, It attracts scientists, professional intellectuals, as well as wide public. According to Gumilov and the neo-Eurasianist ideologists, the state of power in Russia is never really secular because it is bound to a superior esoteric knowledge. Cosmism is an ideology which equally widespread popularity in post-Soviet Russia, developed in the 1920s and again in the 1960s. Is based on several complex concepts by Russian philosophers, including Nikolai Fedorov, and scientists like the geochemist Vladimir Vernadsky. And I'll say Vernadsky has some good ideas. I think Ray Pete, the dietitian, uses a lot of Vernadsky's ideas. The Roosh movement obviously uses some of Vernadsky's ideas. It is actually a better, if you want to look at evolution or Darwinism, or you want to debunk Darwinism, Vernadsky is probably one of the strongest voices against that, but Vernadsky enters into kind of woo-woo zones as well. But I think Vernadsky is also one of the guys that was helpful in discovering that oil is not dinosaur blood, but actually created by bacteria in the Earth's crust. It is a byproduct of bacteria. So this whole idea of peak oil is a complete fraud. But going on, the cosmobiologist Alexander Chivsensky and space scientists like Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. In the ideology of cosmism, theosophical ideas of an esoteric higher consciousness merge with scientific and pseudoscientific bioenergy theories, electromagnetism, and speculations on the cosmos. The impact of cosmism on science in Russia today can be seen in the growing number of conferences, projects, and college textbooks on topics ranging from bioenergy and the so-called torsionic fields to UFOs and extrasensory psychic phenomena. Both political neo-paganism and cosmism are at the same time Russian nationalist ideologies and have become part of the international network of extreme right, which, because of its consistent esoteric ideology, Mark Sedgwick is in his profound study on Rene Guénon, has categorized under the name traditionalism. A third type of involvement refers to the non-political benign use of the occult, either with theosophical or anthroposophical concepts by individuals or communities, or by applying it to healing sciences. Both traditional shamanism and the alternative medicine or systematic psychology, or it can be found in the life and works of individual visionaries whose impact Michael Epstein has called a path in the desert. These people pursue a path of spiritual quest, referring to the traditions of the arcane sciences and occult literature, connecting Western Christianity with Eastern Oriental religion and mysticism. Like Helena Blavatsky, Georgy Gurdjieff, and Peter Ouspensky, the founders of theosophy and occult thinking in the early 20th century. Nikolai Roerich is certainly one of those individual visionaries. All their works have been reprinted and sold in high numbers of copies in Russia today. Another individual visionary is Daniel Andreev, whose novel, or rather mystical tract, The Rose of the World, written in total isolation from society during 20 years of the Gulag prison camps, has circulated in Samizdat since 1960s. The work has been published more than once in the early 1990s and has a considerable impact on Russian writers and intellectuals, if one can judge by the number of contexts in which the name and books are quoted and alluded to. What has established his reception as an esoteric visionary beyond orthodox mysticism is not only his language, the terms he uses through neologisms around sound much like the ones Blavatsky used in her Isis Unveiled, but Andreev also professes the theosophical ideas of pan-religion and reincarnation. Another individual, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the father of Russian space travel, who became a cult figure in the triumphant era of Soviet space travel, was internationally recognized for his technical and scientific texts, to a certain extent for his science fiction writers, but his cosmic philosophy, out of which all his scientific work was developed, and which he himself considered to be his most significant accomplishment, was all but unknown. In more than 400 essays and articles, most of them still unpublished, he explains his philosophical ideas and visions. Driven by the idea of self-perfection and self-deliverance of man, he says there is no end of life, no end of reason in the perfection of mankind. Progress is eternal. If this is so, there can be no doubt in the accessibility of the immortality of mankind. Tsiolkovsky developed a theory of panpsychism, the idea of an animated cosmos in which each and every atom is alive. All atoms flow together to one whole living organism. Organic life is everywhere in space, in which matter is alive and has the capacity to feel. Dead bodies can feel even more intensely than live ones. The ultimate goal of man's perfection is rationally planned reproduction by parthenogenesis, like the Parthenon, which, as he maintained, was the eternal mode in cosmic life anyway. Tsiolkovsky sees it as the most useful and reasonable way to structure and plan the future of mankind. This progress must be corrected by technologically and mentally most advanced segments of mankind, in which all pain, illness, and disease, all minor, incomplete, and handicapped, unworthy life will be abolished, so that all living creatures can ultimately be happy. The main vice or sin behind everything, however, is passion, the libido dominandi, the most irrational power, the uncontrollable drive to reproduce, the sex drive. Tsiolkovsky developed detailed plans to conquer and abolish all threats of the present time, such as the narcotics of music and alcohol. There is also racism in his biologistic utopian concepts. The price mankind will have to pay for the pursuit of eternal happiness and balance will be a certain decrease of susceptibility and perception, some kind of indifference towards the beauties and varieties of nature. Tsiolkovsky's philosophical writings have circulated among scientists and science fiction writers since the 1960s. Some were published or reprinted in Russian or in German translation, but the connections between Tsiolkovsky's philosophy and the theosophical concepts were taboo in Soviet times and only now have begun to be investigated. This is all more surprising since the provincial town of Kaluga, which has always been the center of Russian theosophy, was turned into a massive complex of museum and research center in honor of Tsiolkovsky, the father of Soviet space travel. The cult of Tsiolkovsky as a father of cosmism gained momentum in the 1990s. Now he is idolized in numerous publications as a genius of universal technology, science, and spirit. But as Michael Hagermeister has stated, there has been no reliable critical treatment in any language of Tsiolkovsky's life and work, and both a demystification and comprehensive understanding of the controversial figure is still a task for the future. It is debatable whether Konstantin Tsiolkovsky and Yuri Manlev should be linked to this third type of involvement as individual visionaries. These two controversial figures, the problem of critical reevaluation and criteria on which such evaluations are to be based, remains a problem that must be addressed and highlights one of the main difficulties posed to scholarly analysis of the occult. 4. Scholarly analysis of the occult represents a fourth avenue for involvement. It poses several methodological problems and affords a special approach. Occult thinking covers a seemingly unlimited number of topics, which range from religious and philosophical issues to scientific, political, aesthetic, and artistic questions. It makes both a personal engagement and a collective interdisciplinary approach among inevitable. The nature of sources in documents is highly diverse, contradictory, and unreliable. This is due in part to the literary, secretive self awareness of the ones involved, and the mythologizing and obscuration of the most occult thinkers, and also is the result of becoming part of popular culture and fashion, which is derivative recycling of ideas and fascination for all decadent, inexplicable, and supernatural phenomenon. Finally, some of the visionary texts above are all spiritual texts and therefore afford a special approach which is able to describe the immanent spiritual level of expression as well as analyze the text from a rational scholarly distance. Literature and the occult, subheading. The occult mysticism and literature have always been shared as a certain affinity that stems from a common belief in the magical power of the word. Language as literary device may be chosen for its magical effect or symbolism rather than the aesthetic value of it for explaining ideas. Long before symbolism and romanticism, warnings had been given that the improper involvement in magic and occult could lead to madness. In Russia, esoteric mysticism, literature, and philosophy were always closely connected. The influence of pagan folk beliefs on literature has a long history, and especially since the last decades of the 19th century, intellectuals have been particularly interested in these traditions. One example of the special links between Orthodox religion and occult in the early 20th century can be found, for example, in the concept of Imaya Slaviae, the magic of names, a concept developed by Pavel Florensky. Father Pavel Florensky, who heavily influenced Florovsky, was a contemporary in the Sophiology circles of Berdiev and Soloviev. He came up with the first transcendent arguments that J. Dyer always uses, although he quotes Florovsky for all these things. And Alexei Losev, the magic of, and may I mention, he was a Orthodox father. The magic of names connects archaic Byzantine Christian and 20th century Russian philosophical ideas about magical language. Reflections of this are also to be found in the individual theories of some poets and artists, such as the avant-garde, notably Klebnikov, Kruchenik, and Zdanevich. The literary critic Boris Tomaszewski once asked the question, do we need the biography of an author to understand his texts? I would say yes. The answer depends both on the epistemological interest of the author and the scholar. The above mentioned general methodological problems in scholarly approach to the occult gain a special dimension when dealing with literary texts, particularly with modern literary texts written after the turn of the 20th century. One of the basic differences between non-literary occult writings and the occult in literature is the fact of an individual author. All non-literary writings about the occult, especially theosophical writings, are eclectic, and most do not even claim to be original thought. Even if one can identify certain ideas in an individual style, there are clear differences in language and thought, for instance, between Blavatsky and Uspensky and Gurdjieff. All these writings place the spiritual quest and common goal above the verbal or aesthetic expression of the author. In literary texts, occult ideas, motifs, and symbols can be used as a topic or as a device to produce an immediate effect on the reader. This comes from the symbolist movement. Depending on the attitude and involvement of the author. They can be used to construct or deconstruct or play with the power of language and ideas, or they are designed to intrigue the reader and convey a mystic experience or an occult quest. Daniil Andrei's The Rose of the World is an example of the first, Andrei Belly's novel Petersburg of the second. The tension between persuasive rhetoric and poet artistic dynamics can be maintained or dissolved when the mystic visionary aspects dominate the literary aesthetic expression. In any case, a scholarly analysis of the occult in literature, whether it focuses on the author's biographical context or solely on the text, should not seek to exclude either concern and thus reduce the complexity of the matter. These issues connected with the analysis and evaluation of the occult and mystical text have been discussed in some recent studies of comparative literature, as well as in the study of Russian symbolist literature. Post-Soviet literature in the occult. Valentina Broger's attempt to provide an overview of the occult and Russian literature of the 1990s illustrates that the sheer quantity of text with the esoteric elements renders a complete survey or classification impossible and perhaps meaningless. Broger's catalogs elements range from the fashionable occult lexicon, motifs, and symbols in popular literary genres, particularly in science fiction and fantasy, to theosophical ideas and concepts that shape the plot. For example, the material power and reality of thoughts and psychic energy, the idea of the cosmos alive, a panpsychic approach to nature, Gnostic ideas of a vertical image of man delivering himself to his divine essence, and Manichaean ethics in which the power of the light fights against darkness. Monistic ideas and concepts possessed from Eastern religions, Buddhism, Hinduism from India and Tibet, like divination, initiation, and reincarnation, symbols the cyclical concept of time as a wheel in certain areas of world history, Kali Yuga, a certain metaphysical concept of evil. Such elements can be found, for example, in the prose of Viktor Pelevin, Mark Karatanov, Alexander Borodina, Zulfagari, Alexander Vernikov, and Ekaterina Sador, as well as in certain texts by Victoria Tokareва, Vladimir Makanin, Valeria Narbikova, and Marina Palier. Recent studies on the impact of the occult on literature, art, and science of both symbolism and the avant-garde, both high artistic literature and pulp fiction, as well as some studies the document the occult underground in Soviet Union in the post-Stalinist era. Back to the top, seem to imply that much of today's occult revival has its origins in the 1960s and 1970s with direct ties to the deeper roots in the turn of the century. A number of critical literary studies also indicate a process of reevaluation and reinterpretation of literary classics of the 19th century and 20th century by tracing Gnostic, religious, and occult esoteric influences on Russian literature. 3 examples. So Jay Dyer has Occult Hollywood. We have Occult Moscow, St. Petersburg. 3 examples. Here we go. I will try to illustrate the different types of involvement with the occult in literary texts by 3 examples. The first text, Olesya Nikolaeva's story, A Cripple from Childhood, is an example of fictionalization of pop religion. Nikolaeva, a poetess from Moscow who had published in Russian periodicals since the late 1980s, is the author of 6 volumes of poetry and 1 book of prose fiction. She received the prestigious Oris. That's weird. Boris Pasternak Award in 2002. She currently teaches at the Moscow Literary Institute. The short novel, published in January 1990, marked her debut in prose and represents her longest fiction to date. A Cripple from Childhood, set in the 1990s, is a story of a middle aged mother who travels to the monastery of Old Believers in Odessa to pick up her son, who, after his graduation, ran away from home to become a monk and fight the devils, despise the world, and reject women. Sounds a lot like some of the Rokor priests. Uh, Irina represents a typical New Russian in that she regularly travels to Western Europe and supposedly has a wealthy suitor in England. She not only follows each and every fashionable trend in clothes and lifestyles, but she is also equally attracted to all kinds of spiritual fashions offered on the new market of religions. Her view of monastery as a place suited for an exotic soul searching vacation changes when she stays with a group of poor old women and a crippled young monk, the cripple from childhood, in a filthy cabin waiting for an audience with the elders, starets, whom she calls Cagliostro. During this wait, and then again during the Mass that she attends, she is confronted with the people in and around the monastery, an unspeakably backwards, uneducated crowd, the marginalized losers and outcasts of post Soviet society. Some burst into ecstatic screams for punishment, others, like the young monk and the old women, share an obscure brew of reactionary, superstitious, and xenophobic views on society. The only sophisticated person she meets is an elder, an intellectual who receives her with refined manners, cultivated speech, and responds with fine irony, and she presents her own brew of spiritual orientation, asking for advice which belief she should choose, as if she were trying on several new dresses. Finally, she convinces her son to return with her, and he gives up, digging himself into a one-man cave in the ground and becomes an icon painter. The title of the story may be applied both to the physically crippled monk and the mentally crippled son. The characters are distinguished by their language. The story makes use of an interesting variety of styles, from post Soviet newspeak to the vernacular of Orthodox believers, not unlike the stories of old believers in Melnikov Pechersky's novels, and the refined, lofty style of sophisticated priest, reminding one of the priest Alexander Men. The narrative is written from the perspective of the mother, often utilizing indirect reported speech, so that the narrator's irony puts her at a distance, but at the same time she described not without sympathy. A Cripple from Childhood represents a finely textured, ironic treatment of devastating spiritual and mental disorientation in New Russia. The market of goods to which people are exposed for the first time and for which they seem unprepared corresponds to the random mixture of Orthodox mysticism and Western New Age, which both offer themselves as an instant saving force, but in fact merely add to the general confusion. Yuri Mamlev, a key figure in this late Soviet occult revival, he's one of the most eccentric living Russian writers, an expert in esoteric literature, Buddhism, and in Vedanta Hindu mysticism since the 1950s. Manleaf has been both a spiritual and literary mentor to many of today's postmodern writers. During his immigration in America and Paris, 1974 to 1991, he got connected with the Western New Age and other Russian emigre occult groups and brought much of the French and Western occult literature to Russia. In particular, he introduced to Russia the French occult writer Rene Guénon, who represents an explicitly traditional, if not reactionary, version of occult utopia and has long been popular among intellectuals of Western European New Right. Mamleef's publications made their way back into the Soviet Union via Samizdat. After his return to Moscow in 1991, he once again became the leader of a group of young writers and poets dedicated to what they call New Mysticism. Manleaf's novel Flickering/Airing Time, 2001, represents an example of literary text penned by an individual called Visionary. The novel both continues the author's well established poetics of fantasy monstrosity and at the same time can be read as a late counterpoint to his first and darkest novel, Shatuni, a somewhat brighter version of the same metaphysical problem. Flickering Time is set in today's metaphysical fantastic Moscow. A young man, Pavel Dolonin, is invited by an obscure stranger to a party where he meets a strangely deja vu crowd of the 1960 bohemians and finds himself raping a young woman in a closet and later beating up an old man who gets in his way. To his own horror, he discovers that he was taken on a time trip in the past where he met his own mother as a young man, pregnant with himself, and beat up his own father. From now on, he is obsessed with the search for this self and finding the secret source of time travel. He is drawn into the occult Moscow underground kingdom, where crazy, homeless, down and out eccentrics, artists, and visionaries with names like Squall and Living Corpse dwell in a filthy basement, all obsessively talking about God, Brahma, the Vedanta, and the path to deliver souls. Get away from the curse of life and gain access to divine knowledge. Much like the characters in Dostoevsky's novel The Devils, some are magnetically attracted to one person, the painter Nikita, who has tranced himself into the future and appears before his occult friends only occasionally. A parallel sunblot involves a political conspiracy about an evil leader planning to take over the world and establishing his version of utopia. Alexander Dugin uniformed mankind with low drives and emotions and no metaphysically striving individuality. This is very much the utopia that Konstantin Solovsky imagined in his philosophical writings. The leader of black magic says, journalists, intellectuals, and humanitarians, we don't touch, because the intelligentsia is corrupt and stupid. While he considers them to be harmless, mentally corrupt, and too self centered to bring any change to the society, his real enemies are the metaphysical creative humans. His slogan is occults against metaphysics. Interesting. That Alexander Dugin actually really hates, um, in his attempt to hijack orthodoxy, he really hates the cosmologists around Tsiolkovsky and that tradition. Um, the way to kind of sum this up is future versus past. One believes in the ancient Hyperborean civilization, and one believes in establishing a civilization yet to come. Um, Best way to sum up the big what can we call it? The big struggle of the time in Russia, the battle for the Russian soul. And neither of those are the right answer. So, the simple-minded killer Yulik Posiv is sent out to research the underground community to find and liquidate the metaphysical Nikita. Both Pavel and the killer search for Nikita in vain, but the killer turns out to be the son Pavel had conceived in his time. Time travel into the past by raping the young woman in the closet. Thus, he finds his own double, a spiritual and criminal monster, who finally kills him as well as his chief, the evil conspirator. In spite of the dark ending, the novel concludes with a vision of one of the female characters' death as a transformation into the esoteric realm of eternal Russia, and with a vision. Oh man, it sounds like Sophia, uh, the fourth person of the Trinity that all these Orthodox Christian theosophists tried to introduce. And with the vision of the vague hope for a complete change of the world, and secret of Moscow was seized by an infinite expectation and anticipation that sooner or later, or in the far future, something unbelievable, powerful, scandalous would happen, which would otherwise overturn the foundations of the life of suffering mankind, perhaps even the foundations of all worlds, and which would turn to ashes all the false hopes of the past. The novel favors dialogue over action. The characters propound the author's reflections in esoteric spirituality, which he has published elsewhere in philosophical texts. There is very little individualization in the language of different characters. The setting among the homeless outcasts of the doomed city is familiar from and repeats earlier novels. One cannot help but consider this novel as a literary failure. Nevertheless, it represents a significant development in Manlieve's post 1990s prose. It marks a departure from the aesthetically uh, daring vivisection of the dark sides of humankind and a provocative exploration of total immorality and evil in his earlier prose. He has now turned to a lighter verbal diet of various theories of New Age by characters who don't really act and have no concrete idea of how to change their life other than to reject it in reality altogether. Mamlev, though not politically inclined himself, is a loyal friend of Alexander Dugin, who in return promotes Mamlev's works by reviewing them. Mamlev has published an overtly nationalist nonfiction book entitled Eternal Russia, a collection of classical poems on Russia, together with his own essays written in the style reminiscent of Leo Tolstoy's folk tales for peasant readers, which includes a tribute to the Orthodox Church as the true force of hope and essential attribute of the Russian nation. Manley's occult novels are trapped in the post-atheist condition, and that his underground characters go around in circles in a world isolated from the outside. Recently, they have begun to circle more and more around the eternal Russian nation. My third example is Vladimir Sorokin's novel, Bro's Path, 2004, by Content, a predecessor of the earlier novel Ice, 2002, the second and third parts of the trilogy. The two novels are quite different from his earlier work, both in terms of story and more particularly in language and style, which is almost completely devoid of shocking poetics, of verbal and topical excesses, for which the provocative writer had become famous. Although Bro's Path was published 2 years after Ice, its story chronologically precedes Ice in giving the history of the main hero, Bro, and his prehistory of the esoteric cult that he is engaged in. In the story of the occult order of blonde, blue eyed elected people of light, whose hearts can speak to one other, according to cosmological myth, which Bro, the first member of the order, is given on his initiation, the creation and evolution of Earth uh, has been a mistake of the divine cosmic order. By resurrecting and uniting 23,000 people, the exact number of the circle of the initial rays of light, cosmic harmony can be reestablished. Key to the people's resurrection, and therefore the transmission of the cosmic energy on Earth, is the ice of the Tungus meteorite, which exploded in June 1908 in Siberia. The day Bro was born. Only by breaking one's chest with a Tungus ice hammer can an elected person be identified, whose heart would then speak his real magic name. Names like Fur, Ip, Katzad, Tzu, etc. The new member would then leave his former life and join the order, which is a peaceful kind of aesthetic and asexual community of vegetarian brothers and sisters, as long as you ignore the ice cold brutality which dictates that all non elected people who fail the test be killed with ice hammers. All non elected people are considered inhuman sleepers. Since the story is told in reverse chronological order and the mythological plot is unfolded only in the middle of the second novel, the reader of the novel Ice is confronted with a mysterious series of extremely bloody and cruel random attacks on innocent people in today's Moscow of different ages, social classes, and professions. The sort of sketches of characters' lives before the resurrection present an edgy kaleidoscope of the material and spiritual brutalization and decadence in Russian society. It is thanks to Sorokin's stylistic talent that the descriptions of their childlike life of the endless embrace of harmony after resurrection becomes intriguing in its promising power. It is a sharp contrast to the hardly bearable cynicism and vulgarity of normal life outside the order, be it prostitution, computer or drug addiction, skinhead violence, or business corruption. Since the second novel is told as Bro's biography from 1908, and as its members of the Order travel all over Russia in search of the hearts to attack and resurrect, there is also a wide range of colorful episodes told in a convincingly realistic narrative that being pre revolutionary in early Soviet history to life. As to the uses of occult topics and their function of these novels, I see Sorokin's novels as a parody of post Soviet political occult ideologies, and at the same time as a Gnostic tale in popular disguise. The ideas of the elected Indo Aryan race, with the mission to purge the world of millions of unworthy lives, refers to the connection between Nazi mysticism and the Russian nationalist version of the occult one finds in the theories of Alexander Dugin or Lev Gumilyov. The idea of the majority of mankind sleeping and not really being alive can be found in Gurdjieff's theory. As the first stage of the unconsciousness before awakening, it also corresponds with Nikolai Rorich's concept of Agni Yoga, which is the idea of the lowest race in hierarchy of seven before divination. All these ideas essentially represent considerations of various aspects adopted from Hindu philosophy. According to Tsiolkovsky, the atoms floating in the cosmos are all asleep until human consciousness brings them to life. Ice and Bro's Path also parodied the cult of Tungus meteorite, which has not only occupied Russian scientists and inspired the occult establishment ever since the inexplicable explosion in June 1908, but has also become a cult topic in international science fiction as well as in the Western popular culture. Writers and scientists alike, such as Alexander Kensintsev and the physicist and writer about UFOs, Alexei Zolotov, who followed in the footsteps of Leonid Kulik, the first leader of Soviet academic expeditions to Tungus, have dedicated their lifelong research to the findings of the so-called Tungusko Devoid, the Tungus Wonder. Recent popular treatments include the film The X-Files. And I'll say, Jay Dyer really reveals himself when he goes around, and I just use Jay because he's the foremost example of somebody who's out there promoting orthodoxy, but he's promoted in all of these occult and UFO conferences. and he'll tell you. And he's on Gaia TV and also all around the New Age, um, and that's related to these circles. Sorokin indeed has broken with his poetics of monstrosity. He has confirmed his deliberate return to narrative fiction in several interviews. Moreover, the extensive historical research upon which many of the authentic prototypes are based, from the NKVD officer Yakov Agranov and Leonid Kulik, the famous physicist and leader of the first scientific expedition to Tongass in 1921, also signals this new direction for Sorokin's prose fiction. Nevertheless, he continues to utilize the strategy of subversion by affirmation, a ritualizing depiction of a dominating ideology which is adopted through mimicry, e.g., socialist realism in his Saut's art prose, and now the popular metaphysical discourse of the occult. The worldview of Gnostic pessimism informs many of Sorokin's former writings. As he has stated in connection with these sorts of prose, there is no escape from socialist realism. You have to love it. Now he turns to issues of spiritual value by both exposing the totalitarian essence and the challenge to self liberation by living through it. Sorokin's novels, according to the classification suggested above, may be viewed as an example of the parody of pop religion and neo paganism, at the same time achieved by a chameleon like mimetic assimilation while leaving it open whether there is some hidden serious voice in the desert behind it or not. Being in the world. I conclude with two observations on cultural significance. I think we're almost done here. Um, yeah, this is the ending conclusion. So let's see if there's anybody watching. There's still. Oh, damn. So let's read the comments before we conclude. William Shatner voice. Do good. S90. Cosmogeny. It's like theoretical system of how the universe developed. Abolished. Yeah. The Russian names. I learned Cyrillic. I could actually read them better if it was in Cyrillic because there's less characters. Until the human mind brings them into being, that's like the collapse of the quantum waveform stuff. It isn't existing until it's observed, etc. Yeah, that I think that whole thing is absolutely debunked. Look at my freaking collar. I look like the food review guy. I look like Review Bra. Yeah. No, that the quantum stuff is all a misuse of Schrodinger and all of that, and it really makes me mad because you always have to hear people, talk about the slit experiment, and they always misinterpret it. It more has to do with the fact that the measurement stuff is reorientating the electrons rather than simply witnessing it. But the quantum shit, yes. Um, but let's finish this article and then probably read the other article that I wanted to read. So, our friend says, I conclude with two observations on the cultural significance of the occult revival in Russia today. First, despite the diversity of occult ideas and theories in Russia today, the occupation with the Russian past confirms that the national identity as spiritual legitimization is a driving, motivating force. Most occult writings today tell stories of ethnic or cosmic genesis, but with the exception of Alexander Dugin's ideology of neo fascist mysticism, we can hardly find any ideas about concrete steps one must take to change or better one's life, suggestion of a path to utopia or a life enlightened by occult knowledge. And second, um, the occult in literature is presented both from an insider's point of view, with artists, writers like Mamlev, and from the perspective of distant irony or parody, Nikolavia and Sorokin. But all these representations of the occult detail an asceticism, an attitude that rejects the body and the senses, where sex is presented as a drug, a threat, and the enemy of spiritual liberation. Hence, I see a connection to the utopian philosophical and occult concepts of the early 20th century in Russia from Fyodorov and Tsiolkovsky to the theosophical and anthroposophical concepts as well as the technological utopias of the avant-garde. And that is the end. Birget Menzel, a former visiting scholar of the Harriman Institute. Ooh, Harriman. Those are some bad people um, involved with the Bushes, the Nazis, and the Soviets. If you look through John Foster Dulles and the Dulles brothers, they set up all of these things, and they worked closely with Berdyaev and these self-called Christian Theosophists to set up things like uh, the World Council of Churches and other related pseudo ecumenical um, councils, world councils. Uh, she is a professor of the Russian culture and literature and chair of the Department of Slavic Cultural Studies at Johannes Gutenberg University, Mainz. She is the author of Reading for the Entertainment in Contemporary Russia, Post-Soviet Popular Literature and Historical Perspective. Professor Menzel is an organizer of the conference The Occult in 20th Century Russia in Berlin, March 2007. Be interesting if there's a video recording of that. Might be a lot of different um, perspectives. Okay, well, that's it for the show. This show, we're going on to the next article, so we'll start a new show. I'm going to start doing that more because otherwise you end up like people don't watch all the way to the end. The two people that watch don't watch all the way to the end, and I don't know. I think that's a crime. You should be forced to watch the entire thing. You should be strapped in your chair with the eye things that are in the Burgess novel, Clockwork Orange. Maybe we'll work on that. Maybe I'll send some of those to your house. Well, thanks a lot. Give me a like and thumbs up. I know that there's more of you secretly watching, so please like and thumbs up, share on Twitter, and you really support my work because nobody else is talking about this in particular except 100 other people. So, all right, bye bye.